Versions of their election meddling discussion. Russia says that President Trump accepted Putin's word that the Kremlin did not interfere in the campaign. A senior U.S. official says that Trump did not, in fact, accept Putin's denial. Welcome to hell. That is the slogan of thousands of anti-globalist protesters at the G20 summit. They've set fires, raising black smoke over Hamburg, and engaged in running battles with police. There are hundreds of injuries at this hour. And tactics and pace. As North Korea celebrates its launch of a new long-range missile, Presidents Trump and Putin cannot agree on how to deal with Kim Jong-un's weapons program. The U.S. says it comes down to the tactics and pace of pressuring the regime. Wolf Blitzer is off. I'm Jim Sciutto, and you're in the Situation Room.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Breaking news, Russia's election meddling is at the heart of President Trump's high-stakes meeting with Russia's Vladimir Putin, which ran 4 times longer than planned. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says President Trump opened by raising concerns about Russia's interference in the 2016 campaign. Tillerson says the two leaders had a robust and lengthy exchange on the subject, with Putin denying any involvement and the Russians asking for proof. A senior U.S. official rejects a Russian claim that President Trump accepted Putin's denial. Tillerson says the leaders had a positive chemistry, reaching agreement on a ceasefire for southwest Syria, which he says could lead to even more cooperation. And at Russia's request, the U.S. has appointed a special representative for Ukraine. There have been clashes all day between German police and protesters seeking to disrupt the summit. The protesters did have some success. Melania Trump's spokeswoman says the First Lady was stuck in her hotel for a time. As fires rage in Hamburg and clouds of smoke fill the city, police say that dozens of protesters have been arrested and some 160 officers hurt. And while North Korea is celebrating the launch of a new intercontinental ballistic missile, claiming it will win any confrontation with the U.S., Presidents Putin and Trump have failed to agree on how to deal with Kim Jong-un's weapons program. I'll speak with former U.S. Ambassador Daniel Baer, and our correspondents, specialists, and guests are standing by with full coverage of the day's top stories. We begin, though, with the first face-to-face meeting between President Trump and Russia's President Putin. Contrary to some expectations, President Trump raised the issue of Russia's attack on American democracy. Let's go straight to CNN White House correspondent Jim Acosta. He is in Hamburg, traveling with the president. So, Jim, we're hearing those very differing versions of events from Tillerson and Lavrov. Is the White House saying which one we should believe?
Well, the White House is certainly saying, Jim, that the American people should believe President Trump. Despite his own expressed doubts on this issue, President Trump did press Vladimir Putin on this issue of Russian meddling in last year's election, but there was still some disagreement between both sides on some pretty big issues, including Putin's denials of interference.
President Putin and I have been discussing various things, and I think it's going very well.
Just after the cameras were kicked out of the room, President Trump reportedly did what many of his critics saw as unthinkable.
I'm delighted to be able to meet you personally.
The president confronted Vladimir Putin on U.S. concerns that Russia meddled in last year's election. During a meeting that ran much longer than expected, 2 hours and 15 minutes, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said the president raised the issue repeatedly.
The president pressed President Putin on more than one occasion regarding Russian involvement. President Putin denied such involvement, as I think he has in the past.
Briefing reporters off camera, Tillerson said the two leaders never came to an agreement on the issue of interference.
What the two presidents, I think rightly, focused on is how do we move forward? How do we move forward from here? Because it's not clear to me that we will ever come to some agreed upon resolution of that question between the two nations. So the question is, what do we do now?
But that's not exactly how the Russians described it. Speaking to reporters on camera, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the president accepted Putin's denials.
President Trump said he heard Putin's very clear statements that this is not true, and that the Russian government did not interfere in the elections, and that he accepts these statements. That's all.
Lavrov said Putin complained he is still waiting on proof of Russian meddling.
Not a single fact has been presented, and this is something that has been acknowledged by the people in Congress.
A senior administration official told CNN President Trump did not accept Putin's denials. Still, the president's decision to press Putin on interference is a significant shift. Just a day ago in Poland, the president continued to express doubts about Russian meddling, contradicting his own intelligence community.
Well, I think it was Russia, and I think it could have been other people in other countries. Could have been a lot of people interfered.
And hours before his meeting with Putin, Mr. Trump continued to blame others, slamming former Clinton campaign chair John Podesta, tweeting, "Everyone here is talking about why John Podesta refused to give the DNC server to the FBI and the CIA. Disgraceful." Podesta, who had no ability to turn over the DNC computer server to investigators as he was heading Clinton's campaign, responded, "Get a grip, man. The Russians committed a crime when they stole my emails to help get you elected president." As for the president's meeting with Putin, there was some harmony.
There was a very clear positive chemistry between the two.
Both leaders agreed to work to de-escalate hostilities in Syria and pledged to continue discussions on Russian aggression in Ukraine. That may not be enough for European leaders like German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who appeared to flash an eye roll during her own exchange with Putin. Mr. Trump had other meetings at the G20 that made waves, such as a sit-down with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. The president spared any diplomatic niceties when he was asked whether he still expects Mexico to pay for a wall on the border.
Mr. Trump, do you still want Mexico to pay for the wall?
Absolutely, he said. Now, despite their clash over Russian meddling, the president and Putin did not want to stop their meeting. According to Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, the two leaders were talking so long, First Lady Melania Trump had to poke her head in the door just to hurry things along. Jim?
Jim Acosta, traveling with the president. Thank you. Protesters clashed with police today as President Trump met with Vladimir Putin and other world leaders. First Lady Melania Trump unable to leave her hotel for a time because of these protests. CNN senior international correspondent Frederick Pleitgen is in Hamburg. He's been covering the protests. Fred, thousands in the streets tonight. I'm seeing a fire burn behind you. These look like they're going to continue into the night.
Yeah, Jim, you're absolutely right. They certainly are going to continue. I want to take you here and show you what's going on. This is just one of several bonfires that's going on here in a row of streets, which is in a neighborhood that sort of has civil disruptions every once in a while, but I can tell you it's been a very long time since I've seen something like this on the streets of Germany. You'll also see that some of the protesters here have already put some of the pavement there on the ground, presumably to try and throw that at the police later. That's something that's already been going on. The police itself, strangely, Jim, is actually keeping sort of a hands-off approach. You can see they're back there. Those are water cannon trucks that have been used over the night. You can see some of that, maybe see some of that, those water rays coming out right now. Right now, what the protesters are doing is they're doing sort of run tactics where you see a group of them run from where I am right now towards the police, throw a couple of rocks, throw a couple of bottles, and then run away again. But you're absolutely right. It certainly doesn't look as though this is going to end anytime soon. As you can see, some of these protesters still putting things on that fire, and we're hearing sort of little bangs and explosions every once in a while. I'm not exactly sure if they're also throwing fireworks in there, or if those are cans or something else that might be exploding. But it really is a very, very tense and aggressive atmosphere here on the ground right now. There's also a lot of police officers that are surrounding this area at this point. So this really looks like it's going to go on for a very, very long time. And it is much bigger than you can see right now from where we are. It really goes, I would say, at least a mile down in that direction, Jim.
More than 150 officers injured as well. Frederick Pleitgen, stay safe. Thanks very much. Joining me now is Daniel Baer. He's former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ambassador Baer, thanks for joining us tonight. You're hearing these competing descriptions of exactly how election meddling was raised by President Trump in the meeting. Secretary Tillerson saying raised very forcefully and frequently by the president. Secretary Lavrov claiming that Trump accepted Vladimir Putin's denial of Russian interference. The White House, of course, pushing back on that now. How do you interpret those conflicting remarks?
Well, Jim, I think it's important to remember that there were only the four of them in the room, and so now you've got both foreign ministers out there spinning. The Russian foreign minister came out, Sergei Lavrov, first in saying that Trump had accepted Putin's denial, and then Tillerson caught up. And unfortunately, you know, we don't know what to think. And I have no doubt that Secretary Tillerson's account of the meeting is what Secretary Tillerson hopes or hoped would happen, but it's hard to believe that President Trump reserved the only time that he would forcefully raise Russian meddling in our elections for the time that he was sitting face-to-face with Putin, because even just yesterday he was once again raising doubts about it. So it's really hard to believe the credibility of Tillerson's account of the meeting.
To be fair, there were a lot of questions as to whether President Trump would raise this at all, and apparently he began the meeting by doing so. As ambassador to the OSCE, you've dealt with Russia on many fronts, elections, the MH17 crash, etc. How important is that? Does that carry weight after hearing the many conflicting statements from President Trump regarding election meddling to this point, for the president to lead his first meeting with the Russian president with a discussion of election interference?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical that the President of the United States, after the Russians have attempted to undermine our democratic system, that the President of the United States would lead his first meeting with the President of Russia by raising those concerns. After all, the American election was decided by fewer than 100,000 votes in a few states, and Russian propaganda and active measures reached tens of millions of Americans. So I have no doubt that the Russian intelligence services think that their operation in our election was the most successful Russian spy operation since the end of the Cold War. It's absolutely critical that the President raised this. We should give him no special credit for raising it. It's the responsible thing to do. The question is whether he raised it forcefully, as was reported, or not. And this was a very important meeting for the President because he has been all over the map on so many issues, not just the Russian meddling in our elections, but obviously as well our commitment to NATO. He said good things about our commitment to NATO yesterday in Warsaw, but he said different things at different times. And one of the challenges when you're all over the map is that this kind of disparate sense of where you stand is something that the Russians can exploit.
Let me ask you this, because even Tillerson's description of the conversation did not have the president mentioning consequences for Russian interference in the election. Based on your dealings with Russia, for Russia to stop this kind of activity, which we know for a fact is continuing. We hear this in public testimony from U.S. Officials. For Russia to stop that kind of interference, does it need to see hard consequences?
Absolutely, Jim. Consequences are critical to discouraging Russia from taking further action. Obviously, we also need to do our homework in explaining to the American people just how the Russian operations were carried out. That's why a number of members of Congress have called for an investigative commission so that the American people can understand how Russia manipulated our democracy in 2016 and so that we can be prepared to withstand some of their active measures in the future. But delivering consequences for Russia is critical to this, which is why it's so concerning to learn that the Trump administration is thinking about handing back the diplomatic compounds that were seized in response to Russia's intervention in our election. Also concerning to hear Tillerson himself saying at the end of his attempt to respin the press, Tillerson himself saying that the two leaders were kind of going to agree that what had happened in the past, there were some things we were angry about, there were some things they were angry about, and we were just going to turn the page and move forward. I think every Republican in the Senate who has grilled me or others in the past about the wisdom of the reset under the Obama administration should be loud and clear that the idea that you can turn the page and move forward with the Russians has been something that in recent history we have tried, and it hasn't succeeded. And so that attitude strikes me as painfully naive.
Ambassador Baer, please stand by. We're getting new information about the Trump-Putin meeting. We're also monitoring protests in the streets outside the G20 summit in Germany. We'll be right back with former Ambassador Daniel Baer. From Hamburg, Germany, as fires rage in the streets near the G20 summit, protesters clashing with police under the slogan, "Welcome to Hell." This is President Trump sits down for the first time with Russia's President Vladimir Putin and acknowledges the elephant in the room, Russia's meddling in the U.S. election. But the two sides disagreeing about what was actually said on the subject. We're back now with Daniel Baer. He's the former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ambassador Baer, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who was also in that meeting, says that the question of these Russian compounds that the U.S. seized in retaliation for Russian election meddling during the transition were brought up in this meeting. This comes as a bipartisan group of senators have sent a letter to Donald Trump urging him not to return those compounds closed by the Obama administration. I'm going to quote from this letter. It says, The return of these two facilities to Russia, while the Kremlin refuses to address its influence campaign against the U.S., would embolden Putin and invite a dangerous escalation in the Kremlin's destabilizing actions against democracies worldwide. Do you agree that if the Trump administration, perhaps as part of a quid pro quo or a sign of good faith, returned these compounds, that would send the wrong signal to Putin's Russia?
I do, Jim, and I think, this is a Russian game that they've played a number of times where Russian bad behavior invites a response. In my view, there's more of a response that's warranted, but Russian bad behavior invites a response, and then the Russians cry foul at the response and claim that that is the initial irritant, trying to get you to forget about what they did in the first place to deserve it. I strongly support the view of the bipartisan group of senators who have written to the administration to discourage the handing over of those compounds. And I think that as continued investigation, obviously we have a clear ruling from 17 intelligence agencies that they all agree that the Russians were attempting to undermine our elections, attempting to take down Hillary Clinton, attempting to boost up Donald Trump. As we learn more about that, we should be prepared to deliver more consequences to the Russians in order to target the actors who were responsible for this influence campaign and this intervention in our democratic process.
The other topic in this Putin-Trump meeting was Syria, and it appears some important progress here. The two sides announcing that they have helped broker a ceasefire in the southwestern part of Syria, a truce, as it were, between regime forces backed by Russia and other rebels backed by the U.S., Jordan involved in this as well. How important a step is this in terms of bringing the Syrian civil war to a close?
I think it's probably too soon to tell. I think it's important to recognize that going into this meeting, it was Putin who feels the squeeze on Syria. He's overextended there, increasingly entangled, and so he's the one who feels the squeeze. So it's not clear to me that that deal on Syria is actually a win for the United States, rather than President Trump and the administration giving the Russians more free rein to play out their game. Obviously, it is a good step if ISIS can be gotten out of Raqqa, but it's bad if we don't have a plan for the day after. It's bad if the end result is that Russia, Iran, and Assad get to run the show. So I think it's too soon to tell how this deal will move the ball forward or not. But we should be watching in the coming days and weeks.
Ambassador Baer, you got a lot of experience with Russia. Thanks for taking the time with us tonight.
Absolutely.
For more on what we know about Russia's election meddling, be sure to watch tonight for my producer Jen Rizzo's CNN special report, The Russian Connection, Inside the Attack on Democracy. You could see it at 11 o'clock Eastern Time tonight. Tells the story from start to finish. And coming up, we continue to monitor protests in the streets outside the G20 summit in Germany. You're seeing live pictures there right now. Also, as North Korea celebrates its latest missile launch with fireworks and a huge rally, Presidents Trump and Putin discuss and disagree over how to confront the Kim regime. More on that breaking news from the Trump-Putin meeting right after this.
Choose to go.